Hello, class. This week I want to talk to you about composition. Composition refers to the arrangement of your subject matter in a drawing, and it can also refer to the size at which you're drawing your subjects and where they are placed on the page. And composition can be one of the more intangible aspects of art making. What makes a strong composition against a weak composition can be subjective, but there are certain terms you should be aware of and some factors that contribute to the effect of a composition. I'm also going to be covering thumbnail sketches, which are quick preliminary sketches you can do before any drawing to plan for your composition. Where will your subjects appear? How large? What else will be there? Where are the dark moments? Thumbnail sketches are very handy, and this week you will be doing thumbnail sketches for an exercise as well as in preparation for the homework drawing. And in the future, thumbnail sketches can be very handy for planning and composition. So first, I'd like to go over some of the terms that are relevant to composition. And for that presentation, I'm going to be sharing the work of Philip Guston, who is an American or was an American Canadian artist. And his work is also included in my composition handout for this week. So I'm just going to go over some of that information with a little bit of new information as well for you. So the first thing I want to cover in terms of composition is the idea of balance. And so balance refers to the visual weight of your drawing, the perception of the weight. So if you have, say, a large drawing of an anvil sitting on the top of your drawing, the visual weight will be up at the top if there's nothing else in the drawing, or if what else is there is drawn very light or something like that. And so we refer to visual weight for sort of where the perception of weight or the connection to the ground sits. And there's different ways to achieve balance in a work, and different ways to arrange your subject matter to achieve different types of balance within the work. And the thing is, sometimes you want a nice symmetrical balance, like this painting of a book here I'm showing you now, and other times you actually want a little bit more movement. And so you can actually use the rules of balance in the opposite way to create movement and action and a lack of symmetry. So the first aspect of balance I want to cover is symmetrical balance. So human beings are bilaterally symmetrical. If you cut us down the middle, we are mirror images, and we're also narcissistic creatures, and we enjoy other things that are bilaterally symmetrical. This composition of this book is bilaterally symmetrical. You could split it down the middle, and it's pretty much the same thing on left and right. And so that achieves a sense of balance through that symmetry. So this is also pretty symmetrically balanced. If you split it down the middle, it'd be pretty much the same composition both ways. But what's interesting about this is there's an odd number of subjects here. And so the odd numbers will actually keep a viewer moving through a piece. So depending on your composition, you can actually create a really fixed viewing experience for a viewer, which happens oftentimes if you have even numbers of objects or there's symmetry to it. And if you include odd numbers, the viewer will tend to visually move along through the repetition. So that's what's happening here. It's an example of both symmetrical balance and the use of repetition and multiples. So this next example is of asymmetrical balance. And so the example I give to talk about asymmetrical balance is if you imagine a seesaw can be balanced, say if there's an adult on one side, it can be balanced with two smaller children on the other side. And so it's not that you always need perfect symmetry in a piece to achieve balance. Sometimes you can create symmetry using asymmetry. In the example of the painting I'm showing you here, it's not perfectly bilaterally symmetrical, but you can see that visually the subjects never reach a certain point of the height of the painting. And so they are symmetrical that way. And the object's forms are similar enough in scale that it ends up balancing itself, even though there's more variety there. Another form of balance that you can achieve in a composition is a radial balance, where the point of emphasis is at the center of your subject, and the viewer will sort of look at the things radiating from that center point. So if you look here, the point of emphasis is the center of this ball of drawn objects, and the lines kind of all reach to that center point. So that would be radial balance, where the focus is at the center and everything sort of emerges from one point. So the next aspect of composition that I want to cover is proportion. And proportion refers to scale, the size of the objects that you're drawing. And it's really important to think about what size you want to draw your objects. The larger you draw your object, the more room you have for detail. And so I want you to keep that in mind. But even within your subjects, you can choose, do you want realistic proportions, or would you like to distort the proportions? And so that's something to consider in a composition. So this Guston painting is displaying exaggerated proportion, where there's a lot of distortion. The feet are much larger than the head, and there's foreshortening, and it's quite distorted. And then if you compare this to one of Guston's earlier paintings, this is an example of realistic proportions, which you all have been getting practice on measuring to obtain realistic proportions. And so you can see the two strategies give a very different effect in the drawing. The next thing I want to cover is point of emphasis. So ordinarily, it may not be the best thing for every drawing to put equal importance on everything within the composition. Oftentimes it's smarter to choose a focal point that you devote the majority of your time to, and then the rest of the drawing can be thought of as supporting characters. So with this Guston painting, the point of emphasis is the hand for multiple reasons, which I'll explain. The first is that it's a human part, and so that is going to pull our focus because we're narcissistic creatures. So just by the subject matter, it becomes a point of emphasis. And then also I want to use this painting to show you an example of an artist playing with the idea of visual weight. So there's a kind of heaviness, a density suggested by how dark and sort of dense that hand has been painted. And then it seems to be balancing on just this tiny little stick or pencil. And so it gives the viewer a sense of the weight of these objects, if they had weight. And so there's a strange, interesting playing with visual weight where it's actually quite dense and heavy. And then there's this point of emphasis down where it's just resting on something really small. So even though it's a 2D illusion, you can still give the sensation of actual weight and density in a piece, or lightness. And so then the clouds in the ground are supporting because they're less interesting subject matter, there's less contrast, and it's not the most dramatic moment in the piece. So another way that you can think about composition is through the inclusion of either unity or variety. And so repetition can be a really great way to move a viewer through a piece and give a sense of harmony to a drawing. So if you repeat visually similar forms or the same form, like these wacky horse hooves in this Guston painting, it can create a sense of consistency and also a movement, a rhythm, a repetition. Repetition can be a really wonderful way to move the viewer through a piece, because if something's visually similar, the viewer will follow it along the composition. So you can actually set up a rhythm that moves throughout the piece. The next term I want to go over is harmony. And so harmony is a term used to refer to a balanced composition, a pleasing composition, one that seems like it is orderly, or I would say that a drawing achieves harmony when there's a certain balance between the chaos of it and the order of it. And so I want to use this painting as an example because there's a consistent use of line that's helping to create a sense of unity and harmony. There's a repetition of similar forms that also helps with the harmony of this piece. There's a consideration of visual weight. So the darker values at the bottom create more visual weight towards the bottom and a heaviness, and it sort of grounds the objects in a believable way. And it's balanced nicely against that lighter ground. the directionality of these objects achieves a sense of harmony through symmetry, and then just slight asymmetry creates some movements. In general, diagonals will create movement in a piece, and horizontals and verticals will create a more stable viewing experience, but you're not stuck with any one of these factors. You can be kind of mixing multiple effects within the same piece. The next principle of composition that I want to cover is contrast. And so you can think of contrast not only in terms of dark and light, which I really want you all focusing on for your drawings now, using the full value range, thinking about darkness and lightness of the different sections and how they relate. But contrast can also refer to the type of subject matters that appear in a drawing. So in this painting, you have a crude clock, there's a finger and a horse's butt, and looks like some feet. And those things are very different, not only in terms of what they are, but also what they look like. So the clock being very different from the horse's butt, it sets off contrast within the piece. And I think that if you have a variety in a drawing of subject matter, or even just how you're deploying the drawing material to create some differences, I think that makes for a more interesting viewing experience. If everything looks the same or feels the same, the viewer might dismiss the drawing, and you never want a viewer to think they kind of understand it and move on. So lastly, we have directive objects. So art is interrelated heavily with psychology. And so human beings can be given cues to look at certain things or move and navigate through a composition in a fixed way if you lead them. And so I just want to point out a couple of the things in this custom painting that are deliberately and directionally leading the viewer through this composition. The eyes, viewers will always follow wherever eyes are looking in a piece. So that eye on the left is the first thing I notice, and then I follow its gaze over to that little painting. Similarly, fingers pointing, the viewer will follow that. And then even just where there's something that sort of looks like a protrusion aiming somewhere, the snail shell I visually follow through, the little wood plank I follow up vertically through the composition. So all of these different objects are kind of moving me through the piece. So I want you to consider, when you're working on your own drawing composition, what do you think the viewing experience will be like for the viewer? And imagine navigating through this piece if you were the viewer. So as I mentioned before, composition can be kind of subjective, but I just wanted to give you some of the things to be aware of. I also have a really great rule for composition, which is your subject matter. You should really think carefully if your main subjects are just about to hit the edge of your page, or just hitting the edge of your page, or just breaching the edge of your page. That can create sometimes a cramped feeling or an awkward composition. So I want you all to be especially careful of your subjects getting pretty close to those edges. You not only want to think about the composition your subjects are creating, but also the negative space of your page. How is that balanced? Has it been activated? For some of you, I've left comments in your drawings that you've left dead space. And what I mean by that is, if I say that you've left dead space in a drawing, it means that you've probably left a lot of the blank of the page, and nothing in your subject makes the viewer go over to that blank part of the drawing. There's a way to have a subject interact with negative space, so that way it's activated. I mean, the painting behind me has a lot of white negative space, but I tried to let the composition sort of breach that white space in interesting ways that activate it. So just keep that in mind as well. So lastly, for this video, I wanted to talk to you about thumbnail sketches, which are one of the best ways to plan for composition. And the most important thing for me to communicate to you all is that you should not spend more than 2 or 3 minutes drawing each of these thumbnail sketches. Very often I have students that end up spending such a long time drawing their thumbnail sketches that it might as well just be a miniature drawing, and it's counterproductive. Because a thumbnail sketch is supposed to be a planning device where you plan what size is your subject going to be, where is it going to go, what would you like in it, where's the darkest moments. It's just a really quick, good way to plan that, because oftentimes the first composition we come up with is sometimes the weakest, and it is good to ask yourself, are there different ways to present the same subject? Are there more dynamic or stronger ways to present the same image? And so For your first exercise this week, I've asked that you do a series of 9 thumbnail sketches. And remember, each one should not take you more than 2 or 3 minutes. And I've written up several things that I want you to sort of make these preparatory sketches for. The first one is to think about your most beautiful thing drawing. And what I want you to do is to actually imagine alternative compositions for your most beautiful thing drawing. So I want you to come up with 3 different alternatives in composition for your most beautiful thing drawing. And because I'd also like to hear from all of you what those drawings were about, can you please also add a comment to the thumbnail sketches just telling me what you were thinking about for the most beautiful thing drawing. So the example I gave this week is Jennifer's most beautiful thing drawing was her grandchildren with the peony flowers. And so I wrote in the example that the thumbnail sketches that revisit different compositions could have the 2 kids at different sizes. It could have even something dramatic like the entire drawing is just one peony flower and their secondary images of the kids inside the petals. That's an option. One figure could be closer to the viewer and much larger as an option. So that's just an example. And what you guys are looking at in the screen share right now is my quick thumbnail sketches just to show you what are some of the options that you can fiddle around with when you are playing around with thumbnail sketches. So for this, I thought of the idea of drawing a cat and the moon. And so the first sketch I did is at the bottom left, and that's the most straightforward way I could show you a cat and the moon. It's just sitting there in the center and there's a moon above its head. So then the second thing I tried is the thumbnail sketch next to it where I've zoomed in more. So we're just seeing the cat's head and it's a similar framing. We're just zoomed in. And so I didn't think that that was the strongest choice. So then the one next to that, it's more of a landscape and a cat. And there was something kind of romantic about that one. And what's great about thumbnail sketches is even though they're tiny and quick, they tell you a lot. You will know usually if an idea is worth pursuing or if you want to throw it in the garbage after a thumbnail sketch, instead of wasting paper and time starting a drawing that you would have known if it was going to work out in these quick sketches. That's the point of this. Lastly, I want to show you that you can draw the boxes in any orientation. So the last sketch I did for the cat and the moon is the one on the top, and I've actually turned the box on its side to give more of a landscape view so the cat can be gazing over at the moon on the other side. So that one or the composition before is probably what I would choose if I were to draw this. And I really want you guys to use a ruler to draw boxes. And one thing that's very important about thumbnail sketches is that you generally have the proportion of the page. So even though these are really rough and quick, they're generally the same ratio of length to height as the page. And why you want to do that is thumbnail sketches are not only useful for figuring out subject matter, but also for your composition. How is your subject going to interact with the edges of the page? Where's the balance? What are the scale relationships between the objects? For all of that information, you really need to have the general proportion of the page. It doesn't matter how great your thumbnail sketch is, say if it's a square, because then when you get to your rectangular drawing, it's a totally different composition than what your thumbnail sketch would be. So I hope that that explains thumbnail sketches for you. So read the instructions for this week carefully, because I'm asking for 9 thumbnail sketches for the first exercise. And so those categories are clearly listed. And then I'm also asking for thumbnail sketches before you start your homework drawing. And I will want to see those uploaded to the homework folder as well. All right, thanks guys.